Billy the Kid rode slow into the little town of Esperanza just as the sun was sinking, turning the dust into a sea of orange fire. His horse was tired, ribs showing, but Billy didn't care much for comfort. All he cared about was the way folks scattered when they saw him, how eyes dropped and doors slammed shut. He liked knowing fear walked 2 steps ahead of him. That evening he tied his horse outside a creaky saloon, but before he could push through the swinging doors, he caught a scent on the breeze that made him pause. Burning meat. Not the kind from a cook fire, but something fouler, darker, heavy with fat, and screams that had nowhere else to go. He turned, squinting down the dirt road, and there by a crooked old shack he saw flames licking high into the twilight. A woman stood there, long black skirts fluttering, her face glowing fierce in the light. At her feet was a man tied to a post, already half-eaten by the fire, his mouth stretched open in a scream that didn't come out anymore. Billy watched, curious, not disturbed in the least. He rested a hand on his gun belt, more out of habit than need, and waited to see what this strange widow would do once the flames finished their work. Billy stayed where he was, boots planted firm in the cooling dust, hat tilted just enough to shade his eyes while he studied the scene. The widow didn't seem to notice him at first. She stood there with her hands clasped so tight her knuckles shone white, watching the fire consume the man who'd once shared her bed. Her lips moved, whispering something Billy couldn't catch. Maybe a prayer, maybe a curse, maybe both rolled into one. The flames danced bright and hungry, reaching higher, popping and spitting sparks into the darkening sky. When the man finally slumped forward, ropes burned through. His charred body hit the ground with a soft, ugly thud. The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she walked right up to what was left of him, bent low, and picked something shiny out of the ashes. A ring. Wedding band, most likely. She slid it into her dress pocket, then straightened and turned slowly, her eyes finally locking on Billy. There was no fear there, only a hard, haunted sort of calm. Billy tipped his hat slightly, a crooked smile playing at his lips, almost like he'd stumbled on the best show in town and wanted to compliment the star. The widow just stared, breathing heavy, soot smeared across her cheek like war paint. Billy wondered what story lay behind those eyes, what wrongs had pushed her to this, what secrets still clung to her bones. A small thrill ran through him, the kind he always felt when a new game was about to start. The widow started walking toward him, then, slow but sure, her boots crunching over bits of burnt wood and bone. Billy stayed right where he was, letting her close the distance, enjoying the way her gaze never wavered. When she stopped just a few feet away, he could smell the smoke in her hair, see the way her chest still heaved from whatever storm had torn through her soul. She didn't say a word, only studied his face like she was trying to decide if he was devil or salvation. Billy reached up and tugged his bandana down, revealing the sharp line of his jaw, the faint scar that cut through his lip. Little trophies that marked a life most men wouldn't survive. "Looks like you handled your business mighty fine," he drawled, voice low and easy, as if they were just talking over coffee. The widow didn't blink. She lifted her chin a touch, eyes glinting in the lantern light that spilled from the saloon's windows. Then finally, her lips parted. "He killed my boy," she rasped, each word scraping raw against her throat. "Beat him for weeks, till he didn't wake up." Her voice cracked, but she didn't cry. Billy felt something stir deep inside, not quite pity, more like respect. It took grit to set a man on fire and watch him die. He glanced past her to the black heap that used to be a husband, then back to the woman who'd made herself a widow by choice. "Can't fault you for it," he said simply, and meant it. His hand hovered near his gun, not out of threat, but as if to show her he understood the language of violence all too well. The widow looked at Billy's hand by his gun, then back up into his eyes, and something eased in her shoulders, just a hair, like she realized he wasn't there to judge her or drag her off to face some dusty sheriff. They stood there in the middle of the empty street while night finally settled full around them, stars pricking through the velvet sky, coyotes howling somewhere out past the low hills. Billy could feel the town watching from behind cracked shutters and barely parted curtains, folks too scared or too curious to look away completely. He took a slow step toward her, close enough now to smell more than just smoke. He caught sweat, fear, and that raw iron tang of old tears. "You got somewhere to go now?" he asked, voice calm, almost gentle. The widow shook her head, a tiny tremor running through her. "Ain't got nothing left," she whispered. Her hands twisted in her skirt, still stained dark from gripping the oil that fed the flames. Billy tilted his head, studying her with that same lazy interest a cat gives a cornered mouse. Except this mouse had claws and the guts to use them. Without another word, he slowly offered his hand, palm up. An invitation, not a demand. Her eyes flicked down, wide and wet, then back to his face. Billy didn't rush her. He just waited, patient as stone, a half-smile tugging at his mouth that could have been warm or cruel, depending on who was looking. At last the widow slid her hand into his, small and rough and trembling. Billy closed his fingers around hers, felt the tiny shivers run up her arm, and gave a slight tug that brought her right up against him. For a second she stiffened, maybe expecting him to hurt her, but Billy only held on, letting the heat of his skin promise something different. Not kindness, exactly, but not harm either. The night seemed to hush around them, even the wind pausing to see what they'd do next. Billy leaned down so his mouth was close to her ear. "You ride with me tonight," he murmured, breath stirring loose hairs at her temple. "Ain't nobody gonna touch you long as I'm by your side." He felt her exhale, a sharp, shaky sound that might have been relief. Her fingers clutched his coat, holding on like she'd decided to trust the devil over the cold emptiness waiting behind her. Without loosening his grip, Billy started walking her toward his horse. The saloon doors squeaked somewhere behind them, and a pair of drunk ranch hands stumbled out, laughter dying quick when they saw who stood in the street. Billy didn't bother to look their way. He swung up into the saddle first, then reached down, catching the widow by the waist and hauling her up in front of him like she weighed no more than a bundle of dry sticks. Her breath hitched, but she didn't pull away, settling instead against his chest. Billy gave his horse a nudge with his heels, and together they rode slow out of Esperanza, leaving the smoldering corpse and fearful whispers to rot behind them. They rode under a sky swollen with stars, the widow pressed close against Billy, silent except for the tiny catches in her breath when the horse jolted over rough patches. Billy kept one arm wrapped snug around her waist, the other loose on the reins, guiding them down a narrow trail that wound through low scrub and ghostly cottonwoods. The smell of smoke still clung to her, mixing with the dry scent of dust and horse sweat until it was something sharp and alive. Billy liked it. It reminded him of things burned clean away. After a long while, she found her voice again, small and cracked. "Why'd you help me?" Billy gave a low chuckle that rumbled through his chest into her back. "Help you? Hell, lady, I just offered you a hand out of that town. Didn't see no lawmen running to do it." He paused, feeling her shift a little, trying to peer up at him. "Truth is, I admire a person who don't wait on justice to come find 'em, makes their own." The trail dipped into a shallow gully, and the horse picked its way careful over loose stones. Billy pulled her a bit tighter, steadying her. The widow went quiet again, like she was chewing over what he said. Finally, so soft he almost didn't catch it, she whispered, "I was so scared. But watching him burn, it felt right." Billy's grin went cold in the dark. "Sometimes right and wrong don't matter out here," he said. "Only thing that matters is who's still breathing when the sun comes up." They traveled like that for hours, the moon crawling across the sky and casting long silver shadows that danced alongside them. Billy guided the horse up a gentle rise until they came to a rocky overlook. From there you could see miles of empty land stretching out under the stars, rolling hills, scattered mesquite, the faint ribbon of a creek glinting like spilled mercury. Billy reined in and slid off, then reached up and helped the widow down, his hands firm at her waist. She wobbled a little on the ground, legs stiff from the ride, but didn't let go of him. He led her over to a flat boulder, and they sat, close enough that their shoulders brushed. For a while they just watched the night, listening to the wind whisper through the brush and the distant bark of a coyote on the hunt. Billy finally pulled out a small flask, uncorked it, and offered it to her. She hesitated, then took a careful sip, coughing as the whiskey burned down. Billy laughed low, took a swig himself, then leaned back on his elbows, hat tipped up to stare at the stars. "You ever think about leaving all this?" she asked suddenly, her voice brittle in the stillness. Billy didn't look at her. "All what?" "This land, this life," she breathed. "Start over somewhere no one knows your name." Billy was quiet for a long time, then shook his head slow. "Ain't no place like that for folks like me," he said. "Past's got long arms, always catches up." The widow drew her knees to her chest, hugging them tight, and didn't argue. Maybe she knew her past would come hunting too. Billy let the silence stretch, comfortable in it the way only men used to. Killing could be. He watched her out the corner of his eye, the way her hands curled around her legs, fingers digging into the worn fabric of her skirt. Finally he straightened, dusted off his hat, and stood. "Get some rest," he muttered, voice rough with a note he didn't care to name. He moved a few paces off, back turned, giving her room to settle on the flat rock. The widow lay down gingerly, arms still wrapped tight around herself, eyes wide open and staring at the stars that didn't seem to care one lick for human troubles. Billy stood there like a dark shadow, hand resting near his gun, scanning the quiet hills. Out here you learned quick to sleep with one ear open. Minutes crawled by. Then, so soft it almost sounded like the breeze, he heard her whisper, "What's your real name?" Billy didn't move. "Ain't important," he drawled. "Names are just ghosts that follow you around." The widow swallowed hard, blinking against sudden tears. "I want to know who saved me tonight." Billy turned just enough that the moon caught the edge of his face, carved in sharp lines and dark hollows. "Didn't save you," he said. "You did that yourself. I just offered a road away from the ashes." For a heartbeat she closed her eyes, then opened them again, staring up at him like he was the last honest thing left in a crooked world. Billy looked back for a long time before finally shifting his gaze to the horizon, ever watchful. Morning came slow, crawling up over the hills with a pale gold light that made everything look softer than it really was. Billy had barely slept, kept himself propped against a tree with his hat low, always listening for trouble that might come sneaking through the scrub. The widow stirred at first light, sitting up with her hair a wild mess, soot still smudged on her cheek like a badge. She caught him watching and didn't flinch, just hugged her knees tighter and breathed deep like she was bracing for something. Billy pushed off the tree and walked over, offering a rough hand to help her stand. She took it without hesitation this time. Together they packed what little they had and climbed back on the horse. The widow settled in front of him once more. As they rode, the land began to change, green pushing through the dry brown, signs of water not far off. It was quiet except for the steady clop of hooves and the soft rustle of wind through tall grass. Billy's arm stayed around her middle, loose but sure, the way you'd keep a promise you didn't quite say out loud. After a long spell, she tilted her head back against his shoulder, voice small. "Where are we going?" Billy gave a small shrug she could feel through his chest. "Nowhere in particular. Somewhere that don't smell of burnt flesh." Her breath hitched on a half-sob, half-laugh that seemed to surprise her. Billy felt her relax by inches, sinking more fully against him, and he let it happen. Out here, comfort was rare, and he wasn't about to push it away when it found him. They rode until the sun climbed high and mean, burning down on their backs and turning the dirt trail into swirling heat. Eventually, Billy spotted an old line shack near a dry creek bed, half falling in on itself, but still standing enough to give shelter. He guided the horse over and dismounted, then helped the widow down, his hands lingering at her waist, a heartbeat longer than needed. Inside, the place smelled of dust and mouse droppings, but it was cooler, shadows pooling thick in the corners. The widow sank onto a rickety stool, shoulders slumped. Billy paced slow around the single room, checking for signs anyone had been there lately. Boot tracks, old coals in the hearth, scraps of food. Nothing. They were alone. Finally, he crouched in front of her, elbows on his knees, studying her face with those cold blue eyes that missed little. "You gonna be all right?" he asked, voice low, rough like gravel but carrying something close to concern. The widow tried to smile, failed, then reached up and touched his cheek with fingers that shook. "I don't know how to be all right no more," she whispered. Billy didn't move, just let her hand rest there, feeling the way her skin burned hot from sun and fear and all the ghosts still rattling inside her. After a moment, he caught her wrist, turned his head to press a dry kiss against her palm. When he let go, she looked at him with something raw and grateful shining in her eyes, and Billy felt a twist in his chest he couldn't name, didn't want to name. He stood quick, needing space, and busied himself with unloading their small gear from the horse. As the afternoon dragged on, the widow dozed fitful on a pile of old blankets while Billy sat by the doorway, cleaning his revolver piece by piece, the way a man did when he had too many thoughts clawing around in his skull. Outside, the land shimmered under the sun, silent and empty, except for a pair of buzzards circling lazy overhead. Billy's eyes kept drifting back to the woman, curled up not 10 feet away, hair spilling loose, lips parted in restless dreams. He wondered if she was seeing the flames again, hearing her husband's screams echo off the inside of her skull. Part of him wanted to wake her, offer some clumsy comfort, but he stayed put. He knew from hard experience that nightmares were sometimes easier than the waking world. When she finally stirred awake, blinking at him through the dim room, she looked younger somehow, fragile in a way that made Billy's gut tighten. "I keep waiting to feel guilty," she rasped, voice raw. "But I don't, not even a little." Billy set his gun aside, leaned back against the rough doorframe, and let out a long breath. "Good," he said simply. "Means you did what had to be done." Her eyes searched his, maybe hoping for something softer, maybe relieved not to find it. Slowly, she pushed herself up and crossed the short space between them, settling on the floor right beside his boots. She didn't touch him, just rested her shoulder against his knee, like even that small contact was enough to keep the dark at bay. Billy let his hand drop to her hair, fingers combing absently through the tangled strands, and for a time they sat like that, two bruised souls sharing the same quiet shadow. Evening came creeping in again, long purple shadows stretching across the cracked earth outside the shack. Billy rose finally, stretching the stiffness from his back, then went to the horse to check the cinch and rub him down a bit, giving his hands something to do besides trembling. The widow watched from the doorway, arms wrapped around her middle, like she was holding herself together. After a minute, she stepped out to stand beside him, close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm. "What'll you do with me?" she asked, voice hushed, eyes not quite meeting his. Billy tilted his head, studying her under the brim of his hat, then gave a slow, humorless smile. "Ain't gonna do nothing to you you don't want," he said. "You're free to ride on tomorrow. Pick a new town, start over, or you stay with me a while, see where the road goes." She let out a shaky breath, relief and something warmer flickering over her face. Then, surprising them both, she reached up and cupped his cheek again, thumb brushing over the faint scar on his lip. "I think I'd rather not be alone just yet," she whispered. Billy's smile softened, turned almost gentle. "Reckon that suits me fine." He leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers, not quite a kiss, just a promise that in this cruel land, for at least one more night, neither of them had to face the dark by themselves. The wind stirred around them, carrying the scent of mesquite and far-off rain, and for the first time in a long while, Billy let himself hope there might be more than blood waiting at the end of his trail. They left the shack at dawn, the widow riding behind Billy with her arms wrapped firm around his middle, cheek pressed to his back like she was listening for the beat of something steady and alive. The land stretched out ahead of them, wide and empty, waiting to see what kind of tale these two battered souls might write across its dust. Billy kept one hand on the reins, the other resting over hers, thumb stroking slow circles that said more than any words could. He didn't know where they'd end up. Maybe a sleepy border town where nobody asked questions, maybe some lonely ranch where they could fade into days of sun and silence. Or maybe the road would end the way most roads did for men like him, in gunsmoke and red ruin. But for now, he had her warmth pressed close, the sound of her breath hitching soft when he shifted in the saddle, and that was enough. As they crested a low ridge, the sun spilled over them in a flood of gold, lighting up the dusty world like a promise. Billy tipped his hat down to shade his eyes, let out a long breath, and gave his horse a gentle nudge forward. "Ain't no tellin' what's waitin' out there," he drawled over his shoulder. The widow only hugged him tighter. Together they rode on, two shadows against a bright horizon, carving out a fragile slice of peace in a land that rarely offered second chances. And if you want to hear what hell or hope finds them next, make sure you stick around and subscribe. There's plenty more wild tales where this one came from.